good evening, and welcome to a Dr. Myrna Minute on this Friday as we celebrate July 4th. As we continue to come on in, let us begin to focus. Let us begin to center ourselves so that we can complete our series looking at the connected destiny of Deborah and Barak. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. Like, share, and subscribe. And before we begin, let me do a quick recap as we wait for some more persons to join us. And again, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Like, share, and subscribe. So, as we conclude our examination of divine purpose this evening with Deborah and Barak, I just want to remind us that as we learned in our last gathering, that the power of connected destiny of impact as we explore God's divine plan and God's strategic timing when we examine the narrative and the story of Deborah and Barak. Moreover, we learn that the power of purpose was present in their narrative as they were able to shift and to move the nation of Israel from a place of bondage to a place of experience and peace, which also taught us not just the power of purpose, but of self awareness and how that impacts our relationship and the connections that we have. Additionally, we were able to see Deborah's insight and Barak's ability to trust God and trust Deborah. We were also able to discover or unwrap the power of what occurs when we are obedient to God, when we learn how to trust God, when we learn how to let go and focus on God, when we learn how to walk in faith. Moreover, we learn how to be able to walk in obedience as we follow the instructions of God, as we follow God's voice, which will allow us to experience a purpose that is impactful. We discovered the power of obedience following the God given directions of Deborah to speak to Barak to give him clear instructions. And so we also learned that God had a plan and a purpose for both Barak and Deborah. Individually, God had a plan and purpose for their lives, and together, God had a strategic plan of connected destiny, as when they encountered and when they walked in obedience to what was God saying to each of them, they were able to experience great impact, and so was the nation of Israel. And so tonight, as we conclude looking at the narrative and looking at the story of Deborah and Barak, we will be able to explore how they were able to give the nation of Israel a double portion for their oppression with peace, but also how Deborah and Barak had to have or come from a place of wholeness, right? And we know when we left off on our last gathering, we were able to examine self-integration and wholeness for Deborah. And so tonight we'll focus a little bit on the psychological approaches that were relevant to Barak's narrative. Put your thoughts in the chat. Are you ready for a double portion when you yourself walk in obedience, trusting God, looking to God, and depending on God for God's provision? Or are you searching for wholeness and spiritual renewal as you desire to walk in purpose? Put your thoughts in the chat. Now let us go to the throne of grace. Let us clear our minds. Let us cast aside any distractions that may hinder us from receiving what God has for us on this Friday evening. Gracious and all-knowing God, the God who breathed life into us, the God that created and fashioned us for purpose, the God who formed us, who created us, who crafted us with intentionality. that we may be and become who God has called and destined us to be, so that we can be courageous and walk in boldness, knowing that our identity comes from God and God alone. So, God, we thank you on this evening as we reflect on your mercy and your grace that you have given us and shown us. God, we thank you that even now you continue to speak into our lives. God, we thank you that even in the midst of whatever we may be facing, you are a present God. We thank you that you are our provider. We thank you for your providence. We thank you that you continue to speak. You continue to lead and you continue to guide us. But God, most of all, we thank you because you are a dependable God. You have been and are a faithful God. You are a loving and compassionate God. You are kind, and most importantly, you are concerned about us. God, we thank you that we can approach you as we are. We thank you that you make space for us to lament. We thank you that you make space for us to cast all our cares onto you, for you care for us. And God, we pray that as we surrender every concern, we surrender every burden, we can surrender every weight. We thank you, oh God. We thank you that in you we have a refuge. In you we can find safety. In you we can have trust. In you allow us to experience hope. You allow us to have a spirit of expectation, knowing that you will and you have already allowed us to overcome. Thank you, God, for expanding our mind, oh God, and expanding our territory. God, thank you for being the lifter of our head and the lifter of our heart. God, we thank you for your unconditional love, for your guidance, and for the word of life that you continue to speak into us. We thank you for the light that you allow us to have because we are abiding in you. So, God, we thank you on this 4th of July evening. We thank you. We thank you that we've allowed this evening to come to be present with you. We thank you that you continue to allow us to find rest and safety in you. So, God, we thank you. We glorify you and we honor your holy and righteous name. It is in your Son, Jesus the Christ, we pray and we say, Amen. Thank you, God. Again, put your thoughts in the chat if you can remember what we explored again on our last gathering when we looked at the prophetess and the judge Deborah and when we examined Barak the warrior. And so tonight we continue to examine Deborah and Barak as we conclude with our exploration of their narrative and their connected destiny. And so when we consider where we are personally, are we seeking spiritual renewal? Are we seeking spiritual growth and maturity? Are we seeking wholeness? Do we need reassurance? Whatever it is that we need, God is present. So put your thoughts in the chat. And so as we examine the connected destiny of Deborah and Barak in Judges 4 and 5, we learn the power of purpose. We learn that God uses us to serve God's redemptive plan and purpose in order that we may have impact in the earth for God's people. From a theological lens in our last gathering, we were able to learn the connected destiny of both Deborah and Barak, and how each in their respective positions were warriors. Deborah was a spiritual warrior, and Barak was a warrior with physical abilities. We learned that the connected destiny of Deborah and Barak came at the right time during this crisis that the nation of Israel was experiencing. And so, moreover, that God chooses who God chooses in order to operate and to pull in to God's redemptive plan, in order to make and have impact, as well as the obedience that we learn from Deborah Deborah did not turn away from her call. She did not turn away despite cultural or tradition implications. She was able to walk in her power because she chose the identity given to her by God. And that can be a word for someone on this evening. Have you chosen? Are you walking in with boldness and confidence in the identity that God has given you? Or are you unlike Deborah and unsure? Are you or have you turned away from or not answered the call that God has placed on your life because of tradition, because of culture, or even because of history? So, as we do our recap and prepare to close out the story and the narrative of Deborah and Barak, this is a word of encouragement for you to know that God chooses and that God creates us with intentionality in order for us to have a specific purpose for a specific time and a specific season. And so when we look at Deborah and Barak, the first thing we know is that Deborah had a intimate relationship with God. And I say that again because Barak called upon Deborah to go with him, right? And I say that because it must be applied that Barak was aware of the relationship, or he witnessed firsthand the relationship or the intimacy that occurred between Deborah and God, which allowed him not to trust God, but to trust who Deborah was in God and who God had called Deborah to be, right? Because she was both a judge and she ruled justly, but she was also God's mouthpiece because she was a prophetess, according to chapter 4. And so we know that she chose her identity given to God because we know that she operated as both a judge and as a prophetess. And so when we look at Barak, we know that Barak trusted God. Therefore, Barak was able to trust Deborah. He wanted her to be with him, the one who was called and created to be the warrior. Wanted Deborah to be present with him as he went to battle because he knew that Deborah was God's mouthpiece. And he knew that the words that she spoke could be trusted. And so he wanted her. But I want to surmise that he also wanted her because she was a judge and she was fair and she knew how to use her words in order to incite not just encouragement, but to provide the wisdom of God. Thereby, we can see their connected destiny towards greater impact. Both Deborah and Barak were warriors. Even though Deborah was a spiritual warrior, Barak was a physical warrior, and each operated within their giftings. Both fought, and together they fought a spiritual and physical war. That was their connected destiny for both of them to join their abilities as warrior, spiritually and physically, in order to overtake and overthrow King Jabin of Canaan and General Sisera, which allowed us to see the greater impact because of their connected destiny, knowing that during this time that the nation of Israel was under or had endured 20 years of oppression under King Jabin of Canaan and under his general Sisera. Despite Israel's challenge and despite their lack of manpower and despite their spiritual strength, Deborah, as a spiritual warrior, was able to speak with her authority, right, which was given to her and bestowed upon her by God. And so, because of Barak knew this, because I want to suggest that he had to have a firsthand account of the relationship of God and Deborah, but also the character and the leadership of who Deborah was. And so he was able to ask her to be present. He wanted her to go with him, right? And so because he asked, suggests of his humility, but it also illustrates to us that he was not full of himself, right? And sometimes when we think of a leader, I just want to suggest that being a leader is not someone who only takes or gives an account of or tells people what to do. Sometimes a leader can demonstrate their leadership abilities when they're able to receive from someone else, when they're able to follow someone else, right? And so I want to suggest that Barak was able to demonstrate this because number one, he asked Deborah to go with him. He already had the assurance that God was going to give him victory, right? But even with that assurance, he wanted Deborah to be present, which says to me that he was a humble man, which says to me that he was a great warrior and a great leader because he didn't make it all about himself, right? There was something that Deborah possessed that he wanted her to be present. And I also want to suggest that maybe it just wasn't for Barak, but maybe him that having the desire to have her present with him was also for his men, right? Because we know that she was both a judge and she was also a prophetess. But I also want to suggest that she was also a counselor, right? And so Barak knew this, and so therefore he wanted her to be present. And I want to use my pastoral imagination to say not just to be with Barak, but he wanted her present also to be with the other warriors whom he was leading. You see, because a leader doesn't just focus on himself, a leader focuses on everyone who he's in charge of leading. And so, despite Israel's challenges, despite the manpower and the spiritual strength, right? Barak was able to ask Deborah to follow. And I want to say that despite the spiritual decline that the nation of Israel was facing at this time because they were being oppressed for the past 20 years, that at this specific timing, during this specific crisis, on this specific day, God illustrates God's providence, right? But it also illustrates that Barak too had a relationship with God. Because even after Deborah told him that a woman would get the credit, that did not deter him from having the desire to think about, I want to say, his men and also himself by having the prophetess and the judge and the counselor go with him. And because of that, Barak's physical ability to be a warrior demonstrates that he was also a leader. And so together, Deborah and Barak was able to go to battle, to be Deborah, her spiritual warrior self, and Barak to be his warrior in a physical presence. They were able to restore the nation of Israel from being oppressed for 20 years to a double portion. Because after they won the battle, they were able to experience 40 years of peace, according to Judges 5:31. Leading us to consider the psychological perspective of Deborah that we explored during our last journey together, which we learned the following during our last gathering: that she has self-integration and that Deborah also was whole. Due to the following characteristics: she had balance, she was self-aware, she had emotional regulation, she had strength, and she had inner peace. So I encourage you to go back to 2 weeks ago to look at the clip as I talked about balance, self-awareness, emotional regulation, strength, and inner peace as it relates to the characteristics of Deborah. And we learned this according to psychoanalyst Carl Jung, that self-integration is the continuous psychological endeavor aimed at attaining wholeness through one's journey, right? And within the context of theology, we know that wholeness is embracing one's identity, right? And so both Carl Jung and from a theological perspective, the idea is to be in harmony with oneself, right? That we are able to be whole because we're not dealing with battles constantly, but we have a sense of self-awareness in our identity and who we were created to be. So internally, We have harmony internally, even in moments when we may experience certain things. We know how to get back to a place of harmony. Barack's actions from a psychological lens shows us his adaptability. It shows us that he had emotional regulation, and it shows us that he had humility, asserting that he had a healthy ego. And I say that he had a healthy ego because he wasn't turned off when Deborah again shared with him that if she goes with him, that a woman will receive the credit of the battle, right? Barack didn't change his mind and said, okay, I want to get the credit. So no, you don't come with me. He still wanted the prophetess and the judge to come with him, right? And again, I want to assert that he didn't just want her to come with him because she had a relationship with God, right? I want to suggest that he also wanted Deborah to come with him so that she can be of support and a sense of encouragement to the men that he was in charge of leading into battle. And so showing us that he was secure in himself. I want to suggest that Barack was secure in himself because he was willing to remain with his first ask, which was for her to come, even after she informed him that a woman would receive the credit and not him. And so his ability to be flexible, his ability to act in faith and obedience, his ability to demonstrate that he had courage, but also points us or draws us into the power of interdependence. When we look at the narrative of Barak and Deborah, I want to assert that it is a narrative of interdependence, right? It's not a narrative where one is dealing with power, one is in their head and dealing with their ego. It is a story that deals with their connected destiny because there was an interdependence. They both depended on God, right? They both trusted God. And I want to assert that they trusted one another, right? So leadership involves us being able to ask for help when we need help, right? It also demonstrates that we know how to follow. We know how to receive instructions. Barak was able to receive what the prophet has shared with him. It did not deter him. It did not take him off course, right? It did not allow him to lose his mind. It did not allow him to display that his emotions was irrational and all over the place. He remained the same. His initial acts was for her to go, and it did not change when she informed him that a woman would receive the credit, suggesting that both Deborah and Barak had courage. They both had faith. They both trusted God, and they both were obedient to God, demonstrating there was wholeness of self, demonstrating there was self-awareness, demonstrating that each had emotional regulation, demonstrating that each had strength, and demonstrating that each had an inner peace. And in closing, the call of Deborah and Barak, the way theological and psychological lens draws us to see the power of when we walk into our destiny, right? When we walk into our destiny rather than making excuses or rather than living into our ego and operating out of a spirit of pride. We are able to demonstrate interdependence. We are able to demonstrate that we need God. We are able to demonstrate we don't know it all. We are able to demonstrate, right, that we need one another. And we can learn that in their connected destiny, right? So I want to encourage you to go back and read Judges 4 and read Judges 5 and just expand your mind as you read the pages, as you read the words. Ask God to reveal it in a different way to you so that it can come alive for you. I also want to suggest again that Barak didn't operate out of a place of ego, right? that he had emotional regulation and he was secure in who he was and who God called him to be, the same way that Deborah was secure in her identity and who God had called her to be, which fosters for them to have peace within. There was no conflict because one wasn't fighting the other to lead, one wasn't fighting the other to be in control, but rather they went together, right? Which suggests that there had to be unity. Because sometimes when we operate from a place of pride and sometimes when we operate out of a place of ego, it can cause our purpose to be delayed. It can cause our purpose to be derailed, right? Because there's an internal conflict within. But we know this from the story as we look at Judges 4 and 5. There was no internal conflict when it came to Deborah and Barak. Listening to God is the first step towards purpose. Deborah exemplifies the strength of building a relationship with God, right? Which teaches us that we are in position ourselves to hear from God and that we can hear clearly from God when we are intentional about spending quality time with God, so that we too can walk in faith, that we too can trust God, that we too can walk in obedience, even in times of uncertainty, even when plans change, even if it doesn't look like we think it should look, to still position ourselves to hear from God so that we can walk in obedience to what God is speaking to us. And Barak teaches us that the power of humility and courage to ask for assistance, to be able to trust another. Barak trusted God, and I want to suggest that Barak trusting God allowed him to trust Deborah, right? But I also want to suggest he was able to trust Deborah because the people trusted Deborah, right? His ability to have a secure manhood, right? Because he wasn't ego tripping, right? Because when you consider the tradition, when you consider the culture, when you consider the history of this time, right? He could have said, I'm not taking instructions from a woman, but Barak didn't do that. Not only did he take and receive the instructions from Deborah, he asked her to go with him, which says a lot about his character and his identity and his security in who God created him to be. Because I want to say that he chose to trust God, right? He chose to trust God. And also we can see that he was flexible and that he operated himself out of a place of power and he operated out of a place of humility. Sometimes when we consider power, we can view it in a negative way, right? But power isn't negative. It's how we handle the power. It's how we use the power that can make it negative or positive or harmful or good, right? And I want to suggest that both Deborah and Barak used it in a way that was empowering, right? And life-giving, right? That both honored God and honored one another. All of which I believe led them to walk in courage, led them to walk empowered, led them to walk in trusting in God, walking out their faith. The connected destiny of Barak and Deborah illustrates courage, it illustrates strength, and most of all, it illustrates resiliency. And so when we think in terms of courage for Deborah to operate out of a place of wholeness, right? To be who God had called her to be a leader in her own right, but also for Barak to also operate out of a spirit of humility, right? And both of them operate out of a strength. They both operated out of a strength. They both used courage, right? In order to follow God's plan, in order for their connected destiny to demonstrate greater impact, ultimately leading to the nation of Israel to shift from a place of being oppressed to experiencing peace. Their story of purpose demonstrates resiliency. Their story of purpose reveals perseverance as they collaborated together to transform the people's experience from oppression to experiencing peace. So they went from an experience of 20 years of oppression to be able to have 40 years of peace, which is the double portion. They exemplified strength as a term because they were able to be flexible. They were able to collaborate together. So we can see their interdependence. It wasn't about Deborah and it wasn't about Barak, but it was about what did God say and how can they do this together in order to achieve impact and do and become what God has spoken to them. Their connected destiny focuses on impact, thereby allowing them to experience God's divine purpose for their life, right? Which I want to surmise and suggest it speaks to their resiliency. So on this Friday evening, what's your destiny? Judges 4 illustrates the significance of support and interdependence. It teaches us the power of leadership when it's used to promote God's providence and God's redemptive plan. When they were able to trust God and they were able to demonstrate leadership as a strength, power as a strength, when they were able to get involved and not operate in isolation, but rather together through interdependence, be and become and do what God was calling them to at that strategic time. Representing for us, for believers, that there needs to be interdependence rather than individualism, right? So interdependence is when we are able to recognize I need you and you need me, and we can do this together, rather than operating from a place of ego and thinking I can do this all by myself. I don't need anyone, which is coming from an individualistic perspective. But Deborah and Barak, I want to suggest, came from a place of interdependence. From the psychological perspective, it demonstrates courage, it demonstrates resiliency, because Deborah and Barak's actions can be seen rooted in the confidence and the assurance that they had in God, because God was their provider. So they trusted and believed, I want to assert, God's provision and God's protection, and that God was their provider, right? Unveiling God's redemptive plan and purpose for both Deborah and Barak, which suggests that their leadership and their confidence, right, was developed through relationship and interdependence, and it was not isolated, but it was communal. Together, Deborah and Barak embody spirituality aligned with the destiny and the purpose that God created for them. Their cooperation led to the victory for the nation of Israel, because Israel was able to come out of oppression that they experienced during the last 20 years and experienced a double portion of peace, which they experienced for 40 years. So much so, because Deborah and Barak experienced victory, we learn in chapter 5, it resulted in a song of praise, right? That honored the Lord. But it also affirms that when we walk in our divine assignments, that anything is possible, no matter what it looks like, no matter our background, no matter our gender, no matter what it looks like. Because on the onset, Barak didn't have enough warriors when you compare Barak's army to Sisera's army, right? But he was able to overcome and overtake them because he trusted God and God's plan. And so we can see that the providence of God was present because God worked it out and God brought them through it, and they were able to receive victory. So we see that God's deliverance and God's restoration over the nation of Israel because of Deborah and Barak's obedience. Because Deborah and Barak believed in the providence of God. They believed in the provision of God because they walked in faith despite what it looked like. So Deborah and Barak achieved victory because they followed God's plan and not their own. How many of us are in a season where we continue to try to follow our own plan rather than taking heed and listening to the voice of God and being obedient to the voice of God? And so their praise in Judges 5 teaches us that when we fulfill our divine role and our purpose, regardless of what it looks like, that God will not only get the glory, but that we too can see our fullness and who God created us to be. But most importantly, that we will be able to experience the victory that God has for us and God has over our life. And so, as we conclude, I pray that there was something in this lesson that you enjoyed. I pray that something that I shared with you was planted on good ground and that you are intentional about watering the seed so that you too can bear much fruit and have a greater impact. So I want to thank you for taking the time out and tuning into another Dr. Myrna Minute. And I look forward to gathering with you in community on Friday, July 18th at 8 p.m. as we continue to explore Destiny Focus, Destiny Unveiled, looking at connected destiny. And as always, if you have any questions or would like to explore any topics further, please reach out to me at transform@drmyrna.com. As always, I pray you enjoy your weekend, be safe, and I pray you surrender to God, that you hear God's voice, and that you embrace God's plan and purpose for your life. Be blessed and walk in purpose.